we good to begin? Are we good to get into the second part of our Okay, we are stepping into the second part of the evening where we will spend some time to look at some of the themes of Paul. Try to capture how Paul's themes had developed after the early church, especially the church fathers. And then we will look at one of the men who really got into this whole experience in developing this whole experience of the theology of grace, that is St. Augustine. And he was against certain groups who were heresies, heretical teachings known as the Pelagian and the Pelagius, who were challenging the whole experience of the sacrament of baptism and what we call the grace of God. And then we'll look at Thomas Aquinas and Martin Luther, and how the whole experience of Martin Luther in the 15th century, 16th century brought about the Protestant Reformation, which really split the church together. And then as if you're studying church history, you'll find into how Calvinism and the others started to develop the foundation of Martin Luther's teachings on grace. And then we look at how we will look at theology today by the 20th century. One of the great writers of theology today is Karl Rahner. You find most of the seminaries or the most schools of theology are beginning to develop onto his mind and his writings. We'll look a bit about social sin today. And maybe if we have some time, we will just touch a bit on human freedom, something that is close on human freedom, and then I will try to end up by just giving you a very short synthesis of what has unfolded with us this evening, so you will have an idea of what God's grace is. So in this second part of the evening, I'm simply going to spend some time as we look at the doctrines of theology, is to try to discuss a bit of this whole experience of the themes that Paul spoke about, that Paul spoke about, this whole experience of indwelling, this whole experience of participation, life in Christ, Christ in me, this whole experience of being freed from, redeemed, and being restored back into this whole experience. The word that we use today is being children of God. That's the word we use today, being children of God, So the key word that we speak about, this participation of this divine nature, of this indwelling, of this being a part of this whole experience of God in the person of Jesus, is what we call the word communion. And I think we all are very familiar with the Greek word koinonia, It's communion. It's being participating. It's being one. It's being in union, So this, when I use this word theology of sanctification, you can use the word theology of holiness, the theology of being crafted, as someone just now said to me, crafted into the image of Christ, being one with Christ, being one in the whole experience of the holiness of God. So once when we come closer to God, as we say, this grace to come closer, this purification that I spoke about, the light outside and the light inside, being of the same light, no, like St. Paul would say, I no longer live, Christ lives in me. Jesus has another way of saying, we could say, to see me is to see the Father. The Father and I are one. This whole experience of the sanctification, of this indwelling of God, this Spirit, this participation in the divine nature. These are the words Paul were expounding in his writings. But I'm going to focus into this beautiful text, 2 Peter 1, 3-7. 2 Peter 1, 3-7. This human relationship, this koinonia of human relationship. We speak about this communion, the communion with the Son, or the communion with the Spirit. You can find one text, it's not there. I'm just going to ask you to read this text, 2 Corinthians 13, verse 13. How this koinonia, or this communion of the Spirit, this indwelling of the Spirit helps us to come deeper into this participation of the divine nature. Not like Paul. Paul is a great writer. Paul was able to elaborate and expound his teachings. Peter, was a bit of a quiet man if you look at his life journey. He was more on faith. If you look at the writings and the way Peter went back in his life, Peter was more a person who was defending the faith. And one of the things that when you read 1 Peter and 2 Peter, he was always, he was clarifying, he was defending the faith. And one of the beautiful things that Peter did was to present examples. That's why I'm using this text. How we could live that life in Christ that Paul spoke about. And through baptism, that's how Peter would speak. We could speak about this gift of the baptism and leaving it. So I'm going to focus on 2 Peter 1, 3-7. All right? And I'm going to read this text to you first, and then I will go into this text because this text will give you an idea of what it means to have this indwelling and participation. Okay, 2 Peter 1. His divine power has given us everything we need for life and piety. That's the grace. His grace has given us everything we need to live life and holiness. First, the knowledge of God who called us. That's the first line I want you to remember. First, the knowledge of the one who called us. The key word here is your calling and my calling. Everything is from God. We have been given this knowledge. We have been given this invitation. We have been given this whole experience to enter into this whole experience of God by God only. That is why Paul could say to live a life worthy of your calling in Ephesians 4:1. The whole experience that we are called by God. The second thing that I want you to find in a moment is 2 Peter 1:4. In 1:4 he says this, through them you share in the divine nature after repelling the corruption and evil desires of this world. So in this call and in this participation of the divine nature, we are given one thing. We are given the whole experience to share in the divine nature. And this is in the fullness of time, at the end of time, to be with God. As we always say, we are pilgrims and strangers on journey, and we will be with God at the end. So this whole experience, whether you speak about the parousia, the second coming, which we speak so often at funeral mass, at the second coming or at the end of the time, this participation we can speak is what we call in theology an eschatological character. It's the end of time, end of time to be at the end with God. And the most important part is in 2 Peter 1:5-7. I read to you. So strive. The word here is strive, all right? Strive. You find this word where? Strive to enter the narrow gate. Strive. It's that human push. Strive with the greatest determination and increase your faith with strength, strength with knowledge, knowledge with moderation, moderation with constancy, constancy with piety, piety with fraternal love with charity. What it means, this is the how to do it. Call, first thing. Second, you will participate. The third, how the virtues you need to enter in. The simple 1, 2, 3, you need to experience the whole experience of the indwelling of the God. Once you have gone through these 3 levels, you have already been with God, in the presence of God. To put it in simple way, when you have completed this, the light outside and your light inside is the same light. Just like Lazarus came out from the tomb. The whole experience. So having said that and having to experience this, to look at these 3 slides of this participation of the divine nature, we now take one step further to look at what we call the doctrines. And when I speak about the doctrines, I speak about how one is able to develop this into many ways, So the whole thing that I would like to share with you now is to look at how we can find this growing. We move on to this participation, and I speak with the church fathers. As I say to you now, we have finished the Old Testament, we have finished the New Testament. I spoke about Paul a bit, and I gave you an idea of Peter, who was developing this whole idea of baptism as the entrance and developing it into the whole experience of our call. Looking at that whole experience of the call, what is the end goal and the virtues you needed to experience that. Now we come to the church fathers, the early part of the early Christians. When we speak about the church fathers, we are speaking of great people. Clement of Alexandria, this is around 215, about 200 years after Christ. Then you find people like Athanasius. Then you find people like Cyril of Alexandria, and then Augustine. These are the people which we call today the church fathers, who really took a moment of their life in their understanding how to develop this whole experience. One of the persons, I'm just going to give you one example of one person, is Athanasius, one of the church father, Athanasius. He spoke about this participation very much when he expounded the teachings of this indwelling, of this experience of God in us by the grace of God, when he uses this text, 1 Corinthians 3:16. Do you not know that you are the temple of God and the Spirit of God dwells in you? Do you not know that you are the temple of God and the Spirit of God dwells in you? When he speaks about this whole experience of this indwelling, he's trying to tell you that the Holy Spirit is not something like a creature that comes into us, something external. It is an indwelling that is already in you. So there's no distinction, it's one. There's no separation. It's, to put it in a simple way, it's not a foreign God. It's not a foreign creature that we speak about, but it's a whole experience of entering into this divine nature. That means when this indwelling of the Spirit enters into you, forgive me for saying this, you become like gods. You become an image and likeness of God. And then I can say you are created in the image of God. And that is why when you can tell someone, you see me, you see God. Do you get what I'm trying to say? It's not perfection. I'll give you a very simple way. I remember this many years, the late Father Ignatius one, when he was giving us a retreat, he said, no, God is the capital L. And as you live, you become the small l. You participate in the capital L. Do you get what I'm trying to say? That's the indwelling of God in you. That means when you speak about this indwelling in your love, you become the purification of that creature of God, the creation of God in you. The image of the Lord begins to become a glow. It becomes a life. And that is seen by the virtues of your life, which I said is not a third one. In 1 Peter, 2 Peter 1, 4-7. The whole experience of your life changes at that moment. As I'm telling you this story, I've just got this beautiful text. I remember, I think it was last week. Whenever Moses went into the tent and came out, he was aglow. Can you remember or not? And he had to use this veil. You remember or not? That's the encounter with God. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? The story of the transfiguration. You get what I'm trying to say? So this is the experience that we speak about, this whole experience of what you speak about this human beings become images of gods. When I use the word gods, I'm not talking about the capital G, I'm talking about the small g's of our lives. Not? The next thing that I want to share with you is the Cyril of Alexandria. I'm looking at now at the church fathers before I go in deeper. The church father, one of it that we could speak is Cyril of Alexandria. And Cyril speaks about this text. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? 1 Corinthians 6:12-20. And what happens at Cyril of Alexandria is that when he expounds this to thee, this quotation, he said that this Spirit of God conforms us to God by giving us the grace to share. I use the word share. To share or to participate in the very nature of God. And one of the words that I would like you to sit with is the word crafted. That you become slowly into that whole experience. You know, that the whole experience of your life, that participation of the divine nature. Some use the word sanctifying grace at this point. You become children of God. All right? I want you to remember this, that as you look at this text and this teaching, this is not something at the end of the life. At this very moment that you're living your life, you're already participating. You're already participating in that divine nature of God. But the question is, at what stage you are, and at what level you are, it all depends on the level you are responding to God. I'll give you a very simple metaphor to look at this. If this whole experience is the union of God, where you are seated at this moment. The front row is very reserved, the saints. Then the blessed. Do you get what I'm trying to say? It's the closeness of the union with God in the participation by the life that we live, in the life of the Christ that we live in. It's the dwelling of coming closer. As we speak about this participation, my dear friends, there is 3 important words that you can embrace, that we will find, that you could relate when we speak about this whole experience of this relationship of God. One is adoption, the second is incorporation, and third is the indwelling. These are words that you will find in Paul's ways of looking at it, you know. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Do you not know that you are God's temple and God is the Spirit that dwells in you? This whole experience of this indwelling, it simply means God is present at all times in all things. This is a very personal experience or a personal presence that requires a response. When we look at this experience of this indwelling of God, I ask you to take note that this is the source and the principle for any change to take place that makes us children of God, sharers of the divine life, how we are able to get into this experience. Keep in mind, it's the koinonia, it's the communion with God. It's the union that we experience with God. It's the divine indwelling. And that is why when we speak about this whole experience of members, when we speak about this incorporation, when we speak about this adoption, we speak about the whole experience of our participation in God. Just keep in mind these 3 words as we step into what I call now the doctrine of the theology of grace. Now we are going to expound this in a very, very theological way to see how these teachings over the centuries, over the years, and I call this significant moments that somehow had a great impact on the theological understanding and interpretation of grace. So to begin with, I will start with St. Augustine. Let me bear in mind that St. Augustine is known as the doctor of the church. He's also known as the teacher of grace. He's one of the great teachers that we have in us. And keep in mind that one of the things that Augustine struggled for a great part of his life was his struggle with moral bondage, moral sin. If you are one who is a fervent reader and you are into his writings and his books and his confessions, The City of God, you will find that at some point he was always struggling with himself, and he found himself in a great, great struggle of understanding of God. One of these great writings is, we are made restless until we rest with God. Long, long have I loved you. I searched for you out, but you were in me. There were many things that Augustine wrote that he struggled with, Why I'm saying this? Because Augustine had a very strong influence just after the apostles, the early church, the first 200-300. He had a very strong influence on the thinking and the transition of the church entering into the understanding of grace. Two things that shaped his writings and his theology was the question of human freedom. You will find this in his writings, and on human behavior. When I speak of human behavior, as I said in the part 1, it's a lot to do with our moral life, the life that we live today. Secondly, there were two schools of thought that were unfolding at that period of time. That was, one was the Pelagian heresy and the semi-Pelagianism, two schools, and I will just speak about this. It was very much affected by a man, I think he was a British-born teacher, Pelagius, and he affected the teaching. One of the teachings that he spoke about was on the grace of God. So let's get into the teachings of Augustine. But before we get into Augustine, I think it's only good that we speak a bit about Pelagianism. Let's talk about Pelagianism a bit. Let's get to this man and see what was his teaching that made an effect upon Augustine to stand up. All right? One thing about this Pelagianism is that he said that let me see, that God's grace is a gift from God. All right? God's grace is there. And we also have human freedom. And what happened is this human freedom that we have in us, this choice that we can make in us, it's not affected by original sin. But what is the struggle here is that this human will, this freedom that you and I have, we are able to choose between right and wrong. We don't need God to decide that. We have that. And what he said is, you just have to make a decision in life. And the word here is will. I repeat, will, the human will. And when he speaks about this human will, he says this human will, this decision, yes, there is grace. Yes, there is a gift from God. I'm not saying there isn't, but I can make this decision. I have the human will to decide. And this human will to change, I can have it by discipline of my life. Bear in mind, there are people who still do this. It's called atheism. If you're one into atheism desires is the human will. Being an atheist today, my human will is there. I don't have to have God to desire this. This human will. I can have discipline. I can have some form of ways of doing it. And I can do it. And so this is something that Pelagianism was going about. We will look later how Augustine will speak about this, because this is something that is in us. What is this original sin that Pelagian sin is? Something that we all struggle. He uses the word habitual sin. This habitual sin is in us. It doesn't affect our human will, but we can face and do this by ourselves. We don't need grace. When you say that, it simply means you don't need God. All right? That's the first thing. The second thing is semi-Pelagianism. this view, this I said, when you're coming now to see, yes. It's there, but it doesn't, it's not part of my decision process. I believe in it. You understand? God's grace. But I don't depend on it. But the foremost things that I've shared with you is everything is a gift from God. Even that freedom that you will see is a grace of how God works in you when you're open to respond to it. So this is a cutting away from God already. You understand? I'm not participating. I'm not dwelling in it. I'm making a decision on my own. So, yet he believes. Yeah. So it was a heretic teaching, all right, that was confronting the church. What it simply means, I don't need grace to make the decision. I can make the decision on my own. I have the freedom and the will to decide that. And I can do that by myself, by works of discipline. Second is the semi-Pelagianism. This is a midway between the church teachings and Pelagianism. All right? When we speak about this second part of it, it's a midway. Grace is important, yes. It upholds the necessity of grace, yes. But grace is important, but the human person is not important. It simply means, yes, I believe God and human person is there. When I'm doing this, grace comes in to complete it. Grace is not the starting point. I start the point, grace comes in to help me to complete it. I need you to remember this. The first part is grace is the starting point. Human will is the second point. But here you will see how they have said my human will is the first point. Grace comes in it to complete it. So these two important things affected the church at that time in the early church. They were heresies and they were confronting the church. St. Augustine stepped in and he brought this whole experience of grace to a different level. I will just go step by step and then we will capture how we will see grace in how Augustine speaks it. Number one, the starting point for Augustine is there is human freedom, there is human will. But this human freedom and human will is already locked in sin. So everything is locked. Something to unlock is only grace. Pelagianism said, it's there, but I can decide to open it on my own. I don't need it. But for Augustine, everything is locked. Everything is imprisoned. He uses the word web of sin. So everything is within. The human person is just trapped inside this whole experience. And the only way that we are able to capture this freedom is only when God gives us that moment to enter, or when we are moved by God. Even our turning to God, everything is from grace. And that is why it's an absolute act of God. Nothing that we do, every human revelation, every membership is inside the church. And that is why for Augustine, one of the important things is, outside church, you don't get this grace. You have to enter the church. And for Augustine, the only point of entrance is baptism. Don't look at what's happening today, how we look at salvation. All right? Look at what's happening in the time of Augustine's teaching. All right? Because it's an evolution of time, period. All right? So grace is absolutely needed, yet it does not imply universality. That means not everyone is saved. Only when you are baptized, you receive the grace. Only when you are a member of the church, you receive the grace. So at one point you will understand how this is. If you're not baptized, you're not saved. Remember, at one period of time, this is the part where I'm trying to, we will see how the evolution comes later on. But this whole experience is that everything that happens towards God cannot start without grace. So this divine invitation to step out of this is most important in the last line. Grace acts within and frees us from the inner captivity. Remember, grace is not external. Grace is already in you. You are dwelling in grace after baptism. After baptism, you enter in this. I'll give you another simple metaphor to understand this. Simple way of looking at it. Just say, a young woman, she's into drugs and she's into heroin. For a good period of years, she's been into heroin, and then she's pregnant. All right? And she gives birth to a child. The child at some point is affected by the heroin. Do you get what I'm trying to say? So now there must be an external force or something external to help that child. Medication, treatment, these are what we call, when you enter into this is the grace that helps the person to get that healing. I'm looking for it at a bottom human way of absorbing it. Or another way of looking at it, a child is born in a broken family or dysfunctional family. Parents are abused. The child is being born in a family where everyone is struggling with human relationships and abuse. Somewhere along the line, the child would need counseling, would need therapy. This is the external. But and baptism is the point where the child enters and accepts this. Grace is up there, but this baptism is a simple way of the treatment. It enters in and absorbs that into that salvation. Are you all following me or not? Okay. I'm just trying to see, I'm giving you an external form. But grace is already indwelled in baptism. In baptism, it enters into it. It's not an external form, all right? When we speak about this as what's his name? Augustine was trying to tell these Pelagianism groups who was telling to say that, yes, there is grace, it is external there. I can make the decision by my human will. And semi-Pelagianism said, yes, there is grace, I accept it, but in the process of completing my decision, this one will just help me to complete it. But Augustine says, no. From the very beginning of that human freedom and the human will and the sin, it's all entrapped already. It's all entrapped into it, and grace will only give you that moment to help you to move up to that whole experience. That is how, Augustine was trying to change. Okay, we move on. The next one is Aquinas. Aquinas, let me see, where is Aquinas? You must thank Aquinas today, to a man today. You know what's the feast day today? Saint Dominic, contemporary of Francis. Saint Dominic, because Aquinas was a Dominican, right? He is a Dominican. For Aquinas, he spoke of two important words. He spoke about grace and he spoke about nature. This is important for us to understand because for Aquinas, there is a very important part about grace and nature. For Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, who is a Dominican, he spoke about the relationship between this grace and nature. First thing is, God is the creator, He is the cause of everything. For if you look at St. Thomas of Aquinas, he has a very important way of looking at cause-effect. Primary cause, secondary effect. Everything we do, there is a cause. And we have to return where is the cause. Everything has to return to the origins of where it began. So for Thomas Aquinas, God is the cause of everything. God is the creator, the sustainer, the first primal cause. God is everything. Everything derives from God. Everything, that means creation. Everything on nature derives from God. God is the source. Everything is thing. Secondly, all things that is of nature, that means you, me, everything on this world that is created, there is only one thing. We desire to return back to God. I spoke to you just now about the union of 2 Peter 1, the ultimate end to be the end of God. So this part of it, this interconnectedness is what he calls the spiritual union. This goal at the ultimate end is called the spiritual union. I'm giving you the steps of his thinking. It's the spiritual union. And this spiritual union is simply two things: to have the knowledge of God and the love of God. That is what he says. You have to have the knowledge of God and the union of God. That is why if you're one who studies into the Thomistic writings and his way, he will always speak about the knowledge of God. Everything is about the knowledge of God. And this experience of this knowledge of God is the transcendent which I spoke. The above and the below. We are the one who is inferior and below. The one above is transcendent, which is God. So now, how to reach the above? We cannot attain the goal naturally. By the human nature that we are, because of our brokenness and our shatteredness, we cannot achieve it. Grace is needed to uplift us to reach there. Grace is needed to push us up there. Grace is needed to knock at us and to give us that. It is sense of cooperation. That is why the greatest word of Thomas Aquinas is, grace builds on nature. Grace builds on nature. We merit salvation. That is grace itself. Whatever we do, it has to come from God's grace. This is another way of thinking, because what it simply means, above, below. Creator, creatures. The creatures are natures, above is transcendent. What is needed to lift up is grace, and the only way we can do is we have to respond to that grace. In every form, we have to respond to that grace. Every time we open the door, we respond. Having seen these two great men, Augustine and Thomas, who shaped the theology of the time in the period of that time, we will look at some of the things that affected, after this, Martin Luther. I would always encourage people to read about Martin Luther, not for any reason. Martin Luther, when you return to his life journey, his story of his conversion, when he grew up his life, he was always struggling, just like Paul, with many questions about God. And one of the turning points of Martin Luther, if I recall vividly, was one day when he was coming back from university, he was struck by a bolt of thunderstorm, of lightning. And in this process, he began to worry about judgment. How would God judge me at the end of time? That was something that he was very much struggled with. Death was a question he worried. Yeah, death and judgment. And so he began this whole experience of searching for God. And as you read his life story, he joined the Augustinian monastery and became a monk. And in the monastery, he was again wrestling in search for this whole experience of enlightenment. And there was a lot of periods of his life that he found himself in confession, running in and out, confession, fasting, prayer, just a period of Martin Luther's life. Until when he was going through his studies, he became a priest and he was moving on. Something happened in the church, if you remember the story of the church. And it was somewhere, I think it was 1651. October, I can't remember what year it was. He went to the church of Wittenberg in Germany and he nailed the thesis, 95 I think, thesis on the wall. And that was the beginning of the church Reformation. So when we speak about Martin Luther, and one of the questions at that time was the indulgences. So sometimes one of the questions we struggle with today is still indulgences. We don't go into that. So when Martin Luther when you speak about his background, his faith journey, you will understand that he searched for God, he's wrestled with God, his understanding of God, his brokenness of life. And that is why he always saw himself before God as a very sinful man. A very sinful man before a merciful God who is always in search for forgiveness. He was always in search for, and for Martin Luther, sin was the obstacle, the greatest block for salvation. Sin was something that he couldn't do much. And the only way that could save Martin Luther was God's grace. And grace was God's response to us. I'm just going to give you two or three of, I could remember some of the notes when I remember, 2 or 3 of Martin Luther's teaching, his theology, and then we will see how it affected the church. And I will give you a bit of how the Catherine doctrine answers this Martin Luther's way. One of the famous words is Simo Justus. You know what it means? At the same time, you are just, but you are still sinful. I explained to you. The first thing that he said that was sin was the obstacle to salvation. I used the word concupiscence. It simply means the desire and longing in us, which is the root of all sins. We struggle with it. Augustine said, baptism removes the sin. But Martin Luther says, no. When you give me this baptism, I'm still struggling. How? I already baptized, but I'm still struggling. I become a priest and I'm still struggling going to a confession. You get what I'm trying to say? He says, baptism doesn't remove the sin. He does, when he used the word sin here, he's speaking about the desire and the longing in us. The only thing that grace does for him, he says, it establishes a communion with God. It makes me participate with God. It makes me have a relationship with God. That is what grace does for me. But to me, I am still unworthy before God. I am still a sinner before God. I am worthless before God. I am just a sinner before God. But remember what Paul said, what Augustine said, you are adopted as a child of God. You are saved and redeemed, Lord. And if you live the merits, you already attained the union. You see how Paul and Augustine and Thomas, the union with God, you're going closer to God. But Augustine says, no, we are still stuck in sin. Because I'm tempted every day and I'm falling every day. So that's the first word. The same time, I have grace. Same time, I am sinner. Sin, I am both sides of the coin. I am struggling every day. The second word, that theme that Martin Luther spoke about grace was justification. Justification is, as I said to you, forgiveness. Forgiveness of sins. Remember, he says, I still continue as unworthy. Although I am forgiven in sin, I am still unworthy. This important thing that is important about Martin Luther, when he uses this text, Romans 4, 1 to 12, he says, you are made righteous. You are not made righteous. And this is the one that the Catholic Church contradicts or confronts in contrast to him. Because in the Catholic doctrine, justification, you remember what Paul said in my theme in the earlier stage before break, I said to you, it removes your sin already. And it is a process of how you become holier with God. That purification, you are given the grace to absorb that light into you. But the question is, how do you live that radical change in your life? How you are living your everyday in your life to become closer to the image of God. How much you are dwelling from the back of the room to come closer to God. to be nearer to God. The grace is in you to work for it. And that is why the sacraments are important. You get what I'm trying to say? How much you are absorbing that sacraments to come closer. Yes, yes. Sure. I'm talking about how the Catholic Church understands. This is the Catholic doctrine to answer this. You get what I'm trying to say now? For Martin Luther, his way of looking at the Protestant is, we will come to the next one, I'll explain to you shortly, very fast. Martin Luther struggled with him. He still feels that he's unworthy. He still feels that he is not saved. You understand? And the only way to capture this salvation is only by this. Sola fide, sola gratia. That is how they conquered it at the end. Not by justification, but by sola fide and sola. That means by faith and by grace alone. Nothing you can do, only God saves you. No matter how many mass you go, God will save you. But for us, we have to work for it by the sacraments that God gives us. So his justification for them, that salvation comes only by faith alone. If you have the faith in Jesus Christ, you are already saved. That new life is yours already by faith. By grace, like St. Paul. By grace alone. Grace, God saved you already. You don't have to do anything. You just don't have to do anything. You're already saved. Nothing of human effort. You don't have to do anything. Faith is a relationship with God. No external works. You don't have to go to church. If you are baptized, you're already saved. You know? And this is where the Catholic Church says, God's grace is there, but you have to have a human response. You must effort. You have to find a desire to clean the glass. You have to find a Christian to seek for the light. God will knock at the door, but you still have to open the door to allow God to enter into your life. That is how the church looks at it. And this is what happens in the struggle with the Catholic Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. So for them, just by faith, just by grace, you are saved. New life. And that is why the struggle was there. Faith and good works. Good works and faith. Show me your faith. Show me your good works. Do you get what I'm trying to say? And the third theme that Martin Luther brought forth is cooperation and merit. Merit means goodness, the fruit. All right? These are just theology of Martin Luther. Nothing is of your doing. There is nothing that you are capable of doing because you are a sinner. You were born a sinner, you will die a sinner. There is nothing of your life that is of appropriate. So, whether you are a good man or a bad man, whether you go to church or you don't go to church, whether you step into the sacraments or the non-sacraments, those rituals are not important. These are nothing because salvation and grace is all God's work. But what is important, when you struggle with this, you will find how we fail in social sin. Because you and I have a responsibility to society. Do you get what I'm trying to say? We cannot say, I don't do anything in society. You see something happening, just never mind, I'm already safe. I don't have to respond to the situation. You understand, not? But grace will influence us with an individual and a community. We move to a very important theologian in the 20th century which shaped the church after Vatican and all this too, Karl Rahner. Karl Rahner was a great theologian of the 20th century, which we are in now. Most of the schools of theology are developing this, Two words that is of Karl Rahner which is important is transcendent and a waiter. When you use these two words, remember Thomas Aquinas, above and below. The one that is above and the one that is below. So this thing is revelation and response. This transcendent humanity receives God's gift of grace. And grace is God's way of communication, God's way of reaching out to each of us and indwells in us. And the only way that you could find yourself reaching this is when you are very much attached to creation. Creation simply means when you are in communion with things around you. One word that I find very much strong today when you are into people like the new schools of evolution or cosmology, new looking at things on creation, they use the word today, God consciousness. God consciousness. That means the awareness of God in all things. God in me, God in you, God around. God in me, God in you, God around. I see God's creation in creation. That's why you speak about Laudato Si. When you're able to see creation in the presence of God, when you're able to see ecology and humanness, when you're able to see things in all experience, then that is God's presence. God is revealing to me God's consciousness. And this God's consciousness is very important because it's an awareness of God in your life. I remember a couple of years ago, I took a group for pilgrimage, and as we, from the airport, got on board, got in the plane, then we reached down to Holy Land. And when we reached down to Holy Land and when we went straight into the shrine, one of the ladies says, Father, I feel God is so close to us here. I really feel God is so close to us here. I can really feel His presence. I looked at him and says, when you were having coffee, you didn't see God. When you were in the plane, did you not feel God? You understand what I'm trying to say? This is God consciousness. And this is when we speak about the awareness of God's grace in all moments. God in me, God in you, God around. And when we can see God is all that, then you can see salvation in all things. The development of, see how theology has evolved into many experiences. So this call to salvation, it's active seeking and desiring. The desire in itself is a gift. All this is going back to how the grace is in us from the very beginning that I shared with you. It is always a driven to be with God. The ultimate end, the supernatural end, is to be with God. I'm just going to end up this part when I'm going to speak about social grace. Because after you have seen the consciousness of God around you, when you're able to see God in everything, then you're able to understand your responsibility and my responsibility to things that is happening in society today. Because when you speak about social grace, my dear friends, you must also speak about social sin. The structures of institutions today, the kind of institutions that we have today, the sins that's happening around in society today. You see so many things happening today, from human trafficking, when we speak about abuse, the kind of structures of politics and economic today. When we speak about one of the greatest sins that is happening in all parts of the world today, which Pope Francis and Pope Benedict has spoken, globalization of indifference today, of how we live in this world of social sin today. And this is the response when we speak about our relationship with neighbors. Because this transcending of my love of God's grace must also transcend my love to people around me. How I look at people today. Do I see the face of God in the other person? Do I see the mercy of God that I have received in those who are seeking the mercy of God? So this grace now captures the social character, this God's consciousness of God's grace, especially in social institutionalized sins. And this dynamics of grace, which I spoke about, the dynamics of God's love in the individual and the community today, is now spreading in our life today. How we are looking at things around us. This social grace will will seek us to move to what we call today the love to above. So my dear friends, the ultimate end of this, what I call today, this creative love of God, is to promote institutions against social evil and sins. That is why we have Office of Justice and Peace, Office of Human Creation, all these institutions, promoting human trafficking. All these things is a part of not just me and God, but me and society, me and social. How we live this grace no longer just on a one level, but on a horizontal level and a vertical level. How we lose these dynamics. So finally, before we conclude this part, I just want to give you a brief summary of some of the things that I've been sharing with you. If you want to capture the essence of what has been unfolding to us this evening, grace is a gift from God. Grace is God with me. Grace is a life in God. Grace is a participation. Find the word that you are most comfortable with in your relationship with God. Stay with that word of that relationship with God. And one thing we could say is God reaching out to us in humanity. It's God's revelation. It's God making known His presence. This beautiful word, sanctifying grace, which Aquinas uses, sanctifying grace simply means God dwelling in me. Actual grace means God, it's an external form of grace that's coming. That means when I say an extra prayer, when I do something good, that's the external. God pushes me from outside. This sanctification, this holiness of God that's in me, is something that is already infused in God. My very being, my disposition in the church is already a God infused in me. The last three things that I put there is, when you see someone who is having this experience of God, when someone is already in the state of sanctification, of holiness, of becoming with God, you will slowly feel the presence of God in that person. You will find the presence of God living in you. It means everything that you do, you will just radiate the very being of God, the very presence of God. Second thing is the universality of God. You cannot just say God is only working in the people in Cheras. God's grace is universal. God moves. That is why I said the consciousness of God, to see God in all things. It's the grace of God. God works in all things, And the most important thing is God's presence and gift is to all people, to all humanity. Whether one is baptized or one is not baptized, God is present in there. It's already God. It's the infusing of God is already. The goodness of God's presence is already there. The seed of God's presence is already there. The question is about the response to God. Finally, God touches our being in our doing, our presence of what we do and our actions. The most important is about the transformation in our life. If you were to ask me how I would conclude this sharing today and how we could live this in our life today, grace builds on nature. Nature simply means everything around us. Human, creation, dwelling. God dwells in everything. And there is a sense of perfection that comes in it. God is always working to a sense of perfection. The word here is incarnate and sacramentalized. Sacramentalized simply means God is there. Incarnate means God makes His presence. In everything, in every moment of your life, in every institution, in every individual, in every event and experience of life, grace is already incarnated there. It is in your human daily experience, my dear friends. Even this evening when we take leave of this place and say you're driving home, God is already with you. But the question is whether you are mindful of it. That's all. Usually use the word, I hope you don't get me wrong here. Sometimes people tell me, Father, let us be silent and let us put ourselves in the presence of God. So wondering where was God all the while. Suddenly we have to put ourselves in the presence of God. Don't get me wrong. When we are able to reflect, the most important thing is we need to find time to reflect in that moment of God's grace love. We need to reflect in the presence of God in history. In history simply means in the journey of your life. In the journey of your life and the growth of the kingdom of God in your life. Because the ultimate end is about the kingdom of God, the reign of God, the presence of God in your life. So my dear friends, I thank you for this evening, for inviting me. As I said to you, it is not a seminar, it's a lecture. And a lecture is a lot to do with the head, trying to grasp, trying to wrestle, trying to deepen your understanding of grace in your life. The working of the Holy Spirit, the working of God in your life. You know, great theologians have always seen. You've seen how it evolves in different stages of the church fathers, from the writings of Paul and Peter, from the gospel, from the Old Testament to the New Testament. It's the faithfulness of God's presence in all time. It's how we move into it. There were people who found that they don't need God's presence. The human will can make decisions. The human freedom. But the very thing is that our human freedom to decide is already a grace from God. The human freedom to make that choice is a decision from God. You have it in Him, but the choice is with you. And that is why St. Paul, when he cried out of that struggle, my grace is enough. My grace is sufficient. It is there for you. It is when you are weak, I am made strong. All right. Sister, thank you, sisters, all and brothers. Huh? I am proud to be a Christian, a child of God. Oh, I have to start another lecture after this.